Hello, welcome to another Illuminati live stream. The topic for tonight is extrasensory perception, which I have had so many experiences with that it's difficult for me to understand how it is that it has been so difficult to prove this in a clinical research setting. And in fact, it seems that has actually been done. And one of the most convincing studies actually happened in the 60s. And it involved ayahuasca. So we're going to talk about telepathy. We're going to talk about precognition. Speaking of precognition, something actually happened last night that was really interesting. And I think for me, the value of these experiences is that they, at least in my experience, have implied something more than just the ESP. And what I mean by that more specifically, we'll get into. But basically, it's this idea that we are all part of a greater consciousness. And it does seem to me that these experiences, when they happen organically, are almost always manifest in a way that suggests that some greater mind is influencing them. And I'll give an example of that. The other day, a guy named Morg came up in my feed, and I watched a little bit of his video. And yes, I do know about Kabbalah, but it's a bit off topic. But yeah, Jewish mysticism, definitely recommend it very, very strongly. But that doesn't really fall under the category of ESP, at least not at the moment. So what was I saying? Okay, so Morg. If you're not familiar, his channel's a lot like mine. It's kind of like a goth take on the psychedelic. I think he may have started a religion called Hyperionism, I think. And for the most part, as far as like, I don't know, I don't want to call him a spiritual teacher because I don't think that's what he's going for, really. It's more like a metaphysical sort of teacher. He's one of the, I don't find a lot of fault. The one thing I noticed that I'll mention is that he will sell an idea. God, I got to remember exactly what it was. It's basically a manifestation of the problem with the fact that spirituality has become an industry. People definitely will just kind of tell you what you want to hear. But for the most part, I really like this guy. Oh, that's what it is. The title of the video was Proof that Our Consciousness is Eternal, based on the premise that because energy only transforms and cannot be destroyed. And that's not proof, I guess. That was my only issue, I guess is what I'm saying. But the message, the kind of the foundation, I guess, of his philosophy is that everything has a mathematical basis, which really isn't metaphysical. It's just science, it's physics. But for whatever reason, after I watched this video, I kind of had this vision of these like webs of what I would think of, I guess, as the consciousness, the energy field that is the collective mind. And how it's like I could see it kind of falling off the trees and coming from all the living things, and how their interaction was basically a mathematical and geometrical exchange. And it made me think of these patterns. And for example, the singer from Tool, Maynard James Keenan, I recently saw a very short clip. It was really old. No, actually, this was a new clip. My bad. But a lot of his fans were saying that he had precognized all of this stuff. And he was addressing that, and he said, it doesn't really need to be understood as prophecy. We don't need to invoke like woo, you know, in order to explain these things. It's really just about recognizing patterns. And that really struck a chord with me because I've had a lot of very convincing precognition type experiences. And that was kind of the conclusion that I came to, that the subconscious mind, I mean, it's made of these patterns. Everything that it experiences is based on these patterns. You know what I mean? They're inextricably intertwined with all of the phenomena of nature. And whether we are conscious of it or not, I think the subconscious mind is processing these patterns. And, you know, if you guys are familiar with my philosophical disposition or whatever, you know, if you follow my videos, you know that I'm always kind of trying to integrate or expand. This is a difficult one to articulate, but to explain these phenomena in a way that doesn't violate any of the known laws of science, right? Because nothing can happen that requires overruling or overcoming the laws of creation. And I think that's why a lot of people get frustrated from not getting results when they experiment with magic or even prayer. You cannot do the impossible. It's not that consciousness doesn't influence energy in such a way that it can determine events, you know, beyond the degree that is generally accepted, right, in our Western culture. But if you do not set up mechanisms for the manifestation of your will, conduits that allow it to manifest, you're not going to get a result, right? So kind of strain a little bit. So Maynard James Keenan mentions how precognition can be understood without invoking any kind of spiritual agency or, you know, just a matter of recognizing patterns and extending that pattern into the future. So the other night we started watching a movie called V is for Vendetta. Most of you are probably familiar with it. But when I saw it 20 years ago, I didn't think much of it. It was filmed, I think, in 2000, and it's set in 2020. And it's about a pandemic having seriously reduced the population, race wars in the United States, and on and on. I mean, there are so many parallels with what is actually happening in the world that I think this movie might actually be our best instance of, you know, proof of prescience. I mean, it's very difficult to dismiss as coincidence, and making it even more, like increasing the rabbit hole factor of the apparent prescience of this movie, is the fact that the secondary theme of the movie is that there are no coincidences. Right? So the first two nights we watched, like, you know, part of the movie. And last night, before we were going to go upstairs and finish the movie, totally unrelated, I was thinking about this idea of precognition having some relationship to the subconscious and the recognition of patterns, right? And so we go upstairs and start the movie where we left off. Like, you guys, this is literally the last thing going through my head, right? That precognition is really just like the mechanistic explanation is the subconscious mind recognizing patterns. And we turn the movie on, and there's this detective in the movie. And he starts saying, I had this moment where I saw everything leading up, everything that was going to happen. And I understood that it was because of this pattern. Everything that happens is informed by this pattern. We're all part of it, and we were all trapped in it. So I wanted to share that because, I was literally, I think the reason I was thinking about that in the first place was this live stream. And that's what I was actually alluding to earlier when I was saying that, these experiences often seem to include a greater lesson or a bigger message. It's like the universe was reinforcing my confidence that we have these capacities of consciousness and demonstrating there is a greater mind that anticipates the future. It's dropping lessons. So that was crazy. And if you guys, even if you've seen V.S. for Vendetta, watch it again because wow. And I want to share this before we move on to some of the stories and stuff. The climax of the movie is November 5th. Make them remember the 5th of November. So considering several factors, right? You don't need to be a psychic to make this prediction. But, autonomous, a lot of groups, this was a very popular movie and it obviously inspired some subversive groups like Autonomous, right? The mask that the main character wears. They've had 20 years to prepare. These hackers are definitely intelligent people. It's a safe assumption, for example, that a lot of them invested in Bitcoin before it blew up like I'm pretty sure no stock in human history ever even thought about. I mean, I know people that invested, at $15,000 and are now worth 20 million, even after having lost half, right? So resources, 2 decades to think about it. Everything in that movie just about has come to pass. I would bet, if I had a fortune, I would bet most of it, that there will be some kind of massive politically motivated terrorist attack November 5th, 2020. Mark it on your calendar and stay the fuck away from major cities. Right? Okay, so first, let's talk about research. I honestly expected to find more. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a very famous Italian psychedelic researcher. And I brought this up, and he mentioned that there were some, serious studies going on looking into entheogens or psychedelics, plant medicine, whatever, and ESP. But I was unable to find anything. And there were very few recent studies that offered much of anything that was really compelling, but there is an exception. And unfortunately, I can't read my own writing, so we'll call him Professor Bim because I can't read the first name, at Cornell University. This is a guy that's very famous for having done a lot of psi-type experiments over many, many decades. And he's apparently a very well-regarded psychologist in the mainstream. And he devised an experiment that was so perfectly in accordance with the scientific method that when he published his results, and you guys, this is something to really, really take in, okay? When he published results with impeccable practices as a scientist, the response from the scientific community was not to acknowledge the precognition that he had proven, but they actually mostly, from what I could see, we're questioning the scientific method itself and saying, if this guy produced these results, then there's something wrong with the scientific method. Now think about that. I am not a science denier, but I do know that the scientific method or the scientific philosophy is supposed to be unbiased, first of all, right? Some of the researchers said things like, we were horrified. If you're unbiased, why are you horrified by the results? Right? And we know that bias in research has an impact, an influence on the results. So on a lot of levels, that was very revelatory that, his colleagues would rather question the scientific method itself than acknowledge the results of his experiments, that they said, the methodology was totally sound. And basically all it was is that he had these tests, and the people that studied after the test did significantly better. And I'm probably oversimplifying that, but that's kind of just the gist of it. Right? But that was mind-blowing to see the response from the scientific community. They are so dogmatic about their narrative that if someone produces results that challenge their belief system, they will actually question science before they will accept these results. So, pretty incredible. And, Darwinism is largely misunderstood. It's not actually survival of the fittest. It's survival of the most adaptable. And I would say that in light of, the scenario that I've just elucidated, science itself fails the Darwinian test, right? And I think I'll make an analogy for you guys. If you build a foundation that has within it a faulty premise, you may still be able to erect a structure, but every part of that structure is going to be informed by and partially defined by the foundation. And so that is how science has ended up with all of these massive blind spots. One of the best examples I can think of is evolution. I'm not an evolution denier, but blind random mutations are not satisfying to me. Darwin himself said that the human eyeball was so complex that it pretty much disproved his theory. And again, I'm not saying that evolution isn't real. I'm just saying that it's not satisfying as, a holistic answer, an explanation of how we've arrived at this, juncture. And it's always baffled me that religious people, for example, are so offended by the idea of evolution. Is God dead? He's not going to take an active role in his creation? Why can't it be both? Why is that so difficult for, materialists on the one hand and religious people on the other hand to just it's a work in progress, and there is an intelligence that is integrated into all of it. Okay, so my personal experiences. I was trying to think the other day, like, what is the very first time that I ever experienced something that very strongly implied that telepathy was a real thing, or that precognition was a real thing. And I'm not really able to narrow it down that specifically, but the first major instance of telepathy that I can recall experiencing, I had a girlfriend, and she was, a mile away on top of a mountain. There was a Fish concert in Telluride. And I felt like I needed to walk off into the peaks of the mountains and deal with something. I didn't really know what that would be. So I went up into the mountains and ended up having what I perceived to be a conversation with God, where some really crazy stuff that made total sense was revealed to me. And then as I was walking back into town, I had this like imaginary conversation going through my head. And I didn't believe that it was a real conversation or anything. At this juncture, I'm seriously questioning that. So I went to the car. There was like this Burmese mountain dog that I ran into. All these little details, right? And so I go to the car and I can't get in. I don't have my keys. And I'm really cold and I need my clothes, but the girl got in a pickup truck and I don't know where they took her. And so I start like just walking back into town thinking I got to find her. And she walks up and just starts babbling like, you went up into the mountains and then God told you blah, blah, blah. And then you were walking along and having this conversation with this person in your head. And he was trying to explain to you all this stuff. And I'm not getting into the particulars of it because it's not really appropriate. But long story short, she knew everything that I had been doing and every single, when she was talking about the thoughts that went through my head, she knew every word of it. And then she's like, and then you got to the car and you couldn't get in. And I realized I had the keys and blah, blah, blah. Right. So I actually asked her, how the hell do you know all this? And she said they were narrating it to me. I didn't ask her who they were. That was kind of the end of it. But the specificity, I guess, of all of the stuff that she knew, there's just no way. There is just absolutely no way that she could have guessed all of that stuff. And a lot of what was going through my head was so random, and I had this theory that, if a radio or a television set can pick up frequencies, translate the information into pictures, sound, the human brain is the most complex, advanced, and least understood system in the entire universe. The idea that it could pick up other people's brainwaves and translate them, that doesn't even seem like, you know what I mean? It's like almost just like, obviously, yes. Right. But she was a mile away. And later, with my current partner, I've experienced telepathy from thousands of miles away. So, in keeping with my philosophical disposition of trying to integrate this stuff with a, modern scientific deterministic, how does this stuff actually work? It has to have a way to play out, right? The theory of entanglement tells us that, particles of energy that are, say, 300 million light years away respond instantly, regardless of the space. And so if nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, but we know, by the way, we know this, we have technologies that use this, that use entanglement. There are computers on the space station that are entangled with computers on Earth. We actually have technologies that use the theory of entanglement. This isn't some new age, Einstein didn't like it. He called it spooky action at a distance. And he said, no way, this can't happen. So I'm not necessarily positing exactly that the theory of entanglement is the explanation for long-range telepathy, but it at least informs us that energy has established, to scientific satisfaction, that instantaneous responses, which we could also, I think, call communication, can happen over tremendous distances. Big C248, come on down, man. Okay, so let's talk about plant medicine and entheogens a little bit. I've had these experiences both with and without entheogenic substances. And of course, the skeptic would say, if say your friends come over and they're all excited and they're like, man, last night we ate some mushrooms and we were all telepathic and blah, blah, blah. And people are like, oh, yeah, you're just high. Seems like a reasonable reaction, right? If you've actually experienced psychedelics, I think you kind of know that you're not as delusional as people that might not have experienced these things would imagine. It's not really like that. Even with ayahuasca and DMT, things that are very powerful, they cause very powerful visions. True hallucinations, which is where you can't distinguish what's happening from reality, are actually extremely uncommon. The visions are almost always like cartoony, or they're, the difference. But, also I want to mention a great adept of the mysteries once pointed out that the mystery always presents itself in a way that casts doubt upon itself. And in my experience, this is real wisdom. And psychedelics would be one of those kind of scenarios. But the reality is that the documentation of ayahuasca, for example, causing remote viewing and telepathy, goes all the way back to at least the 1700s. In the diary of Sir Walter Raleigh, who I believe was an English explorer, he describes having met with a shaman in, I think, Peru. And the shaman told him, when I drink the vine, I can know anything. And Sir Walter Raleigh said, okay, tell me something that you couldn't know. And the shaman said, your sister is dead. Later, Sir Walter Raleigh discovered that his sister had died, I think, the night before. And I don't know that that's the earliest record, but it's the earliest record that I'm aware of. Also in the 1950s, maybe as early as the 40s, but definitely in the 1950s, Richard Evans Schultz, who was kind of like a psychedelic Indiana Jones. He was a Harvard professor, I think, of botany. He was an ethnobotanist. Interestingly, he said that ayahuasca and other psychedelics had no effect on him. But he devoted his life to going down to the jungle and studying them anyways. At one point, I think he got lost for like 12 years in the jungle, and they found him like crawling out of the jungle with 12,000, new species of plants. He's like dragging them behind him while he's got berry and God knows what else. There's a book by a guy named Wade Davis called One River, who was a student of Richard Evans Schultz, that I would very, very strongly recommend. But point being, Richard Evans Schultz and other anthropologists from that period documented shaman describing the Eiffel Tower, very specific places in China. And these guys definitely had never left the jungle. Okay. And this is, there's a lot of documentation of this kind of stuff. And so when the vine was originally studied in the United States, the researchers actually called the compounds in the vine telepamine because they were producing reliably telepathy in the laboratory. There's a book called The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience by 2 PhD doctors, masters in Houston, very well respected. They devised an experiment with ayahuasca where they had somebody on the bottom floor looking at very random pictures, right? Like stuff that in order to reduce the probability that people could guess correctly, it was really crazy shit, right? Like people skiing down a hill that's in flames and there's a UFO. And then the person who had drank the vine on the top floor would have to describe what the person on the bottom floor was looking at. And the accuracy, I think they determined to be like 99% or something crazy like that. And this is one of the most baffling aspects of this whole thing to me is that there are institutions and individuals in the Czech Republic, in the UK, in the United States, offering as much as $1 million for anyone that can prove any kind of ESP phenomenon. I know a shaman. I could almost hit his house with a rock from where I'm sitting right now, that will come and sit beside you and start talking to you about whatever you're thinking about, sometimes 4 or 5 times a night. No matter how random, weird, specific. I do this too. I mean, I facilitate sometimes, and it's like you can just look into someone, see everything that's relevant, you know exactly what to say, their eyes bug out. I mean, this is actually the condition, I guess, of the shaman and like ceremonial attendee, like where the sexual evils kind of come in, because a lot of times the response from, women in particular is that like, oh my God, this person, like they can see right inside of me, totally understand me. There's this like connection that oftentimes is based upon these sort of telepathic experiences that are so common. By the way, you guys, I see some of you are like always here, and some of those names I have been seeing since almost the first video 2 years ago. So it's really heartwarming to see that you guys have, stuck with me and supported me. Also, earlier, I wanted to mention that, I really appreciate all of the really supportive comments and stuff. You guys have been sending a lot of really encouraging messages, and I really appreciate that. By the way, all of the psychedelic literature that I recommend on this channel, along with a whole bunch of nootropic supplements and stuff that, I really feel is the best of the best, right? There's a link to an Amazon store. And of course, you can support us on Patreon. We really appreciate it. Okay, so we're talking about ayahuasca and its long history of association with these kind of ESP type phenomenons, right? And there is also a neurobiological explanation, neurochemical and neurobiological maybe. And it's this idea that we have filters in our nervous system that screen out all of the thoughts of other people and the information that we're constantly being bombarded by, the energies that manifest as like these crazy geometries of sort of translucent, glowing colors that, by the way, everyone seems to see them the same way. These colorful patterns that kind of float when you take psychedelics, and also with different psychedelics, the way they manifest a little bit differently also seems to be consistent. We know that because there are, of course, graphic designers and whatnot that are able to reproduce them online. And I'm saying that suggests that we're actually looking at something real, right? So there are filters that screen out all of this stuff. I mean, I think we only see like 1% of the full spectrum of light. Most of the universe is not perceptible to us. And so the explanation for why psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, DMT, all of these things facilitate like telepathic experiences and precognition is that these filters are temporarily suspended. And so different compounds bring down different filters to different degrees for varying amounts of time. And honestly, I do believe that is true. But a number of these experiences that I've had have not had anything to do with psychedelics as well. They're definitely not required. Which leads me to one of the bulletin points of all of this. I haven't counted, but I have experienced, and I'm a very skeptical person. In order for me to change my worldview, things have to be pretty convincing. So if I'm only counting like the impossible to ignore level ESP type from precognition, telepathy, shared experiences with people from hundreds of miles away, dozens of them. Why is it so difficult to prove in the laboratory? And also, I don't claim to be able to do this stuff intentionally. It has been extremely sporadic. I do feel like I experience manifestations of the greater mind or minor precognitions pretty regularly, but it is interesting that it seems to be so much of a random, intermittent kind of phenomenon. But I have met people that are at least able to read minds very consistently. And much to my surprise, I've discovered that this is actually very well known. In Santa Cruz, I don't know if they're still there, but I guess it was 10 years ago or so, I encountered these mind-reading street people. And later I would find out that the locals knew about it, which blew my mind. I'll tell you guys the story. So I was going through a very intense period of like synchronicities and just spiritual revelation and all of these crazy experiences. And so I found myself one night in Santa Cruz, California. And just so bizarre. The first instance, and this isn't really ESP, it's just kind of entertaining. We walked down by the ocean, and there was this guy with a big clock around his neck, like that rapper. I can't remember his name. I think he was in Public Enemy. But he had that clock around his neck, and he just started. Well, it is ESP. I mean, it wasn't as direct as the guys I ran into later that night, but he just immediately launched into subject matter that was on my mind. And the funniest thing about this guy is that he fancied himself a rapper, and he would occasionally start like trying to freestyle rap, and it was just dumb. It didn't rhyme. He was out of time. But then when he spoke, it was brilliant, eloquent, everything rhymed. And I was just, the whole time, I was just like, man, what the hell is up with this guy? It was crazy. You know, it's like when he was speaking, it was amazing freestyle prose. And as soon as he started trying to freestyle rap, he was like the embarrassing white guy at a party, you know? So, I had someone with me as well. So there was a witness to all this. So we walk downtown and we run into this like cluster of like homeless street musicians. And earlier that day, we didn't just drive by it, actually. We went into the Hearst Mansion. And it was significant in a lot of ways because at the time I was really like deep into the mystery schools and the Western occult tradition, and a lot of the symbols that I had recently come to awareness of were very much on display in the Hearst Castle. And so that was meaningful. So when I was there, though, I thought, man, it would be fucking awesome to have a gig here. I had a band at the time, and I was like, man, this is just incredible. All these, esoteric statues everywhere. And for whatever reason, I just imagined my band setting up and like rocking the house in this weird ass castle. Right. So back to leaving the rapper, right? We walk downtown and we run into this group of homeless musician guys. And one of them walks up to me and he says, hey, that idea you had about doing a gig at the Hearst Castle earlier today, I think my brother could arrange that. And I just looked at him like, what the hell? And if you guys watched my last live cast, I talked a little bit about this meeting with the Native American spiritual leaders, I guess, priests and medicine men from a bunch of tribes, Hawaii and the Sioux and whatnot. One of those guys' names was Reynolds, right? And there was another significant character that I never asked his name. He had a shirt on that said, "Is it?" So I thought of him as the "Is it" guy. And this is, you'll see the relevance of that in a moment. So after he mentions this gig that I had been thinking about doing, he says, something about Reynolds. And then he's like, hey, yeah, I'm the "Is it" guy. And he starts talking to me about the stuff I had been discussing with the guy with the "Is it" shirt on. And for a second, I thought, because Reynolds had called the weather, which is another aspect, I guess, of ESP phenomenon that I've witnessed. I would say that qualifies, right? Like I've seen a man say, may the wind blow to confirm the power of our prayers. And the wind fucking blew so hard that gravel was blown across the parking lot. Right? So, but this guy basically identifies himself as Reynolds, and the guy with the "Is it" shirt all of a sudden takes over. So I'm thinking, like, is he channeling these people? They want to send me a message because, I mean, I saw the guy command the wind. It didn't really seem unreasonable that he could, maybe send a message through some weird drunk homeless guy. But then I realized that he was identifying these people according to how I thought of them. The "Is it" guy gave it away. So I actually called him out. I was like, wait a minute. You're just plucking stuff out of my head somehow. What is going on here? And he said, we call it sacred drinking. And I'm not going to get into every detail, but several of the other guys that were sitting in this cluster did it just as well as him before the end of this exchange, right? And he told me that at some point in the last like year or two, maybe, some guy had come down to the homeless, encampment and gathered some of them together and taught them how to, he said, you have to drink like, 1 or 2 beers, maybe 3, but you can't get drunk. But the beer helps to quiet the conscious mind and make you more receptive. And then you can kind of just pluck the thoughts out of people's heads. And he said, we call it sacred drinking. And some of them had actually used it to, they would go up to some like rich yuppie couple, pluck all these thoughts out of their head. And then the yuppie couple would take the homeless guy home, give him money, feed him, let him live in their mansion. Right? So there are these street people in Santa Cruz that use mind reading as a hustle. And so after this happened, I went into the gas station and bought a drink. And I said to the girl behind the cash register, man, this homeless guy out there and a couple of his buddies, she's like, yeah, the mind reading street people. only like 20% of them are really good at it. And I was like, holy shit, the locals know about this? You know, I'm still trying to convince myself that I'm stark raving mad or something. And the locals know about it. And since then, just the other day, I actually saw a fucking meme about this. Somebody, and you know, I'm actually assuming that it was referencing something along these lines, but it was a meme of Alice sitting with Dorothy. And Dorothy says to Alice, yeah, I've seen some weird shit too. I've been to Santa Cruz. And I could only assume that it was a reference to one of these type of experiences. And I've actually had a couple of people say, yeah, I know about the mind reading street people of Santa Cruz. Right. And so there was another girl, she was associated with the Star Tribe folks, Golden Light Eagle and Reynolds and that whole crowd. But right after Santa Cruz, we went down to LA. And this was crazy because the reason I had left Colorado was that I had gotten into all these sort of like specific occult type practices that I knew that Danny Carey, the drummer from Tool, was really, really into. And I assumed that because he was a millionaire and a rock star, he probably had access to things that I didn't have access to. And so I actually told my friends, I'm going to go talk to Danny Carey. I got in my Toyota Camry. I was going to go myself, but my girlfriend spider monkeyed me and ended up coming along with us. We got stuck in Vegas for 3 days, which I want to point out is something that I sort of interpret as evidence that there's some greater mind capable of influencing circumstances, because if we hadn't been stuck in Vegas for exactly those 3 days, and we just miraculously like sold some rocks that I had in the trunk or something to get gas all of a sudden out of nowhere, like, you know, $150 or something, we wouldn't have made it to LA in time for this shit to go down. Right. So, and bearing in mind that I literally told like 6 people, I'm going to go talk to Danny Carey from Tool, who is a rock star that tours the world, could have been anywhere on earth. I did not check, right? When we get to LA, we pull up behind this place called the Baked Potato. The owner comes out and he just says to me, Danny Carey's going to be here tonight. Me and my girlfriend just look at each other like, what the fuck? So we go and park the car and I set up my amp and I'm playing my guitar. I had a little battery powered amp so I could play on the road. And I see Danny Carey walk into the back door. And this is like a little shithole. It doesn't even make sense that he's there. Right? We're in a bad neighborhood. It's an open mic at a dumpy bar. It turns out he actually does frequent it for fun. But I didn't know that. Right? And later, I go in, and this was crazy too. I had $15 in my pocket. When we first got there, the sign on the door said you needed $7 to enter. I went and sat with my girlfriend, and I go back out, and they had changed it to $15. So I had $15 exactly, no change, just enough to get in. So they play, and then later Danny's walking out the back door, and people are yelling at him, you know, and I walk up to him as he's putting his snare drum in the back of his minivan, and I say, "Hey, Danny, could I talk to you privately for a minute?" And he has just ignored all these screaming people, right? And he goes, "Sure." Stands up and turns around, and man, this guy's like 6'7" or 6 foot. I'm a big guy, right? But I was like, damn, you know, he shook my hand and it's like my little girly hand just disappeared. And we went out in the alley and we talked about consciousness and the occult and manifestation, all this stuff for like 15 minutes. I tossed him a rock at one point. I'm mentioning that because for you patrons, I'm going to make a video about this rock that was allegedly from the Pleiades, right? And was actually taken to a college, to 3 different professors, and tested at a chemical laboratory. Because the guy, the professor said, I've never seen anything like this. Take this to Bodo Park to this laboratory, right? So I go down there, and the guy says, if this isn't glass, then it's really an alien rock. So do I have your permission to put this drop of chemical? Because if this is glass, it's going to melt a hole right through it. Right. And the guy put the drop, nothing happened. And he looked at me. You guys should have seen this rock. And by the way, it's not gone. It's not gone. We have a bunch of specimens. I don't want to get too deep into it because we're already kind of getting off track here. But didn't melt. And I actually tossed that rock to Danny Carey. And he's like, whoa, what the hell? But so that's just another level, I guess, of this whole ESP thing. Right? I mean, what are the chances that that could all transpire? I want a piece. Yeah. I'll try to describe this to you guys, even though it's, a little off topic. And coincidentally, right, I worked with glass at the time. And when we were given these rocks, and this was at the meeting that I described in my other live stream about alien contact, where we had seen, the natives commanding the weather, and we're being told that the earthly tribes have always been in contact with the star tribes and all of this stuff. And we walked up to the table, and I saw the lady get this box out from under the table. Like, it wasn't on display until we walked up, and there was a rock for each person in my band. And it's very difficult to describe, but the rocks were like, okay, so there's a layer of stone that's clearly stone, obviously real. And then there's what looks like bright blue crystal, but a color that no mineral, like, I'm a rock hound. That's what Danny Carey said too. He looked at the rock and he said, man, I'm way into gems and minerals, and that's one of the most fucked up things I've ever seen, right? So we get these things from this lady, and I'm thinking, like, why in the hell would somebody that actually had rocks from a spaceship just give them to people anyways? But we're looking at it, and my friend who had been a glazer way longer than me was like, there is no way that you could attach stone to glass in order to create this illusion. Right. So I actually sent him a message to please dig those rocks up, because we need to investigate this more. Mine is actually in the possession of a Navajo medicine man named Night Horse. And once again, that story will be in the patron only. Okay, so another element of this precognition thing, and this also comes with a warning. When you start to expand your consciousness, when you awaken, it's very much like going insane. In fact, I would even say that it seems to me that schizophrenics are people that the filters that we intentionally take down in our consciousness, schizophrenics they're just all torn down. And so they are overwhelmed and inundated by the information, and they lose the ability to distinguish their thoughts from the incoming signals from, I don't know what, the spirit realm, from other people, whatever. Right. So they're not exactly just crazy. Lost my train of thought there, I'll be honest. But where I'm going, I think with this I can remember. The precognition and the warning. That's it. It is a very common experience that people have these precognitions. They have experiences of telepathy. So they start to think that every thought that they have is intuition, or ideas, things they might want to believe, right? Their subjective desires erode their capacity to distinguish between real intuitions and what we call wish demons, right? So it's very important in all aspects of life to think like an investor. If you think you have an intuition, Don't pursue it to the extent that it's going to potentially damage your life, and you'll be safe. Meditation is also really helpful in that regard. But that is worthy of mention, that when people talk about the perils of consciousness expansion, the Buddhist masters tell you to ignore the cities, which are these extrasensory perceptions as they develop, as you elevate your cognition and your consciousness. That's kind of what they're talking about, because it is extremely difficult to safeguard against those things. It definitely cost me substantially. Okay, but what I was saying about precognition and the potential errors. One day during this period, right around the same time, that I just somehow drove my car right to Danny Carey and experienced the telepathy with the girl and met with the Native Americans that were telling us that there were star tribes communicating with us telepathically and all of this craziness. One day, I was sitting at home, and this voice in my head was like, there's going to be a flood. People are going to die. And there were storm clouds rolling in. It was monsoon season. So I kind of got freaked out, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. I'm in the foothills. How is there going to be a flood that is going to represent or present any danger at all? To me, this doesn't make any sense. But the peaks of the Rocky Mountains were just a 30-minute drive away. This feeling that there was going to be some kind of terrible, tragic flood was like really, really powerful. So I grabbed a tent, a couple of fishing poles, got my girlfriend, and we drove up into the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. And sure enough, it poured and poured and poured. But eventually it stopped, and I was like, I knew that was just dumb. And I drove home. The next day, I drive down to the gas station. I glance at the front page of the newspaper, and it says, flood in Pakistan kills hundreds. And I'm like, what? And that was one of the elements of the vision that I had of this flood that was not consistent with the environment that I was in. It was not a mountainous terrain. It looked like desert, and I think eventually that flood actually claimed hundreds of lives. So that's the kind of thing. I don't think that I don't think it was coincidence, but it was a very powerful lesson that dexterity dealing with these kind of phenomena actually takes some development. It seems like it's a good time to point out that in most indigenous cultures, or even I guess the older traditions like Buddhism in India and Asia, the initiation and the training that accompanies the initiation is there for a reason. And I think that because our culture has, I would say, degraded to a point where we don't really revere the shaman. We don't consider a mystic like, it's not like a status quo pride kind of, you know what I mean? Those of us that are really embarking on this path, and, if we're successful, we don't have the kind of guidance and the preparation that evolves in societies that, have reverence for the spirit world. And I think that a lot of the things that people do and say that kind of discredit the spiritual movement, that encourage skepticism of ESP type phenomena, we just don't have the guidance to always discern well enough to serve even ourselves, much less present something that seems credible to the mainstream. So I'm probably going to do another section on this because it's been about an hour, and that's about all the time I have for tonight. But I definitely have a lot more to say about this. But I'll leave you guys with what I consider to be probably the most compelling bit of evidence that cannot be disputed in regards to ESP or precognition type phenomena. Robert Anton Wilson, who I feel like, it's like Terence McKenna in the psychedelic community has kind of eclipsed the other people like Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson. And I think that's unfortunate because all of those people had a tremendous amount to offer that, a lot of it, even with Timothy Leary, I think is more pragmatic, or, we can use it in a practical sense to a greater degree even than Terence McKenna. And Robert Anton Wilson in 1974 wrote a book called Cosmic Trigger, The Final Secret of the Illuminati. He is probably more responsible for the conspiracy theory movement, or bringing the Illuminati into popular culture, than any other person. But Cosmic Trigger was written about this experience that he had where he was telepathically connected to alien intelligence from Sirius, and it transmitted all of these secrets of the Illuminati and the Freemasons. And shortly after he published that book, his daughter was beaten to death while walking home one night. And in every interview after the death of his daughter, he says that he just went insane, that the Cosmic Trigger stuff was nonsense, blah, 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 right? I don't think that he ever concluded for sure that his daughter was killed because of what he had written in Cosmic Trigger, but I think it definitely influenced his decision to blame it all on a psychotic break. And I challenge you to read the material, because I think that if you have a look at what is presented in that book, it seems to substantiate itself. But so here's what happened. The Illuminati Trilogy, which I mention a lot, Timothy Leary said that it was more important than Finnegan's Wake. I think that the average person's consciousness probably has to expand in order to even deal with the plot. My mind was blown recently when I found out that he claims that they actually would cut up the book and toss it into a hat and pull it out and splice it together at random. But here is the bullet point of this presentation. In the book, he gives the coordinates of an Illuminati pyramid at the bottom of like the deepest part of the ocean. Before he died, a few years before he died, a pyramid was discovered at exactly that location. You know how fucking big the ocean is? Right? And you can actually look on YouTube. There are videos of interviews where somebody asked him, like, what in the hell? And based on what I was saying about Cosmic Trigger and the possibility that his daughter was beaten to death because he was putting too much out there, he just kind of mumbles and he's like, yeah, coincidence. Come on, you guys. The ocean's massive. So definitely read that book. Check it out for sure. So I guess in closing, for what is apparently going to be part one of the ESP live streams, the experience of unity consciousness, the temporary suspension of our individual perspective, causes changes in people that are organic and therefore legitimate, I guess. that constrain them to function in support of life and novelty and creativity and all these things. So the real value of these kinds of experiences for me is that they represent a connection to that. No, it's the Illuminati Trilogy, which you can order a copy of my Amazon link in the description. Okay, so there's one other ESP type phenomena that I have not mentioned that is interesting. I've had experiences with other people that were like a shared experience. So, and this is the last story for sure. I had a friend. I was not romantically involved, and actually in this world, we weren't very close, although we both acknowledged that we had some sort of spiritual connection. One night, I was lifted like a foot off my bed by this blue light and spun around in circles and then dropped back down. And there was a lot of information coming in. And it was a very intense experience. But by the next morning, I had dismissed it as sleep paralysis, which I think is the name given to that basic experience. So I didn't really think too much of it until I was woken up by my phone ringing, and it was my friend who at the time was in Denver. And I should explain this a little bit. The experience that I had was of this blue light, like this electric blue light, and this energy had, picked me up and it was spinning me around. And as I was spinning around, I looked at the clock and it was 5:30 in the morning. So my friend that I had this weird connection with calls me up and she said, "What happened at 5:30 in the morning last night?" And so being cognizant of the possibility of influencing, someone's perception during this period, I was very aware of not doing that. I said, "What happened to you at 5:30 in the morning?" And she said, "Well, I was lifted up out of the bed by this electric blue light, and it spun me around, and I looked at the clock, and I saw that it was 5:30 in the morning. And then it dropped me again." Pretty specific, right? So it's been about an hour. Definitely didn't get to everything, but I'm going to have to sign off. Thank you guys so much. And be safe out there, open-mindedness, tempered with skepticism, alchemical thinking. If you take two extremes and combine them, when the third thing emerges, it's much more likely to reflect truth than the two things that you originally combined. So I want to remind you that Sunday, I'm having the second half of the Grateful Dead Music Marathon in honor of the days between which August 1st, Jerry Garcia was born, August 9th, he died. So we're going to do some more somber, downbeat kind of stuff with a much better microphone. So make sure you tune in with that. Topical Tuesdays. Every Tuesday, we're going to talk about topical stuff. We did the conspiracy theory versus the mainstream narrative last time, and I missed a lot. So this Tuesday will be an extension of that. And Fridays, we're going to do Metaphysical Fridays from now on. I'm going to try to put out a normal video on Wednesdays. So quick summarization, you guys. Consciousness is a unified field that we experience from a very real, but also somehow illusory, singular perspective. And if we carefully and mindfully engage in practices that bring down those filters, we can have experiences that I call gnosis, that catalyze a process within us that harmonizes us with the field of consciousness that creates the order and gives rise to life and creation and all of these beautiful and wonderful things. I will play Broke Down Palace 100%, absolutely for sure. And because this is an ESP live stream, I will mention one more thing that you just reminded me of. There was a medicine man named Rolling Thunder that came to visit Jerry Garcia before the Grateful Dead even got famous. And he said, you are going to be the leader of this band that creates this movement of these rainbow people that are going to ultimately harmonize the world. But he also told him, I think the date was July 9th, the last Grateful Dead concert. It will end on July 9th, which freaked the band out that year because they thought he meant that year. But ultimately, maybe it was July 5th, whatever the last Grateful Dead concert was. That was actually prophesied by this Rolling Thunder medicine man. But the Grateful Dead only did 2 encores twice. And once was the last show. And there are a number of elements that suggest that Garcia knew that he was dying. And the Dead had a rule that they never referenced their magic, their ability to influence the weather, or there were certain things that were off topic. And if an interviewer brought them up, the interview was terminated. And that was one of them. So for the first time, Garcia actually addressed the weather command, and the audience had gotten like really out of control. There were riots. The National Guard was getting called in to control the shows because they were so big and insane. And in the song, Garcia sings, the wind don't blow, the rain don't fall, and you no longer hear me when I call, which seemed like, a direct reference to the ability to influence the weather. And he was known as a very reserved singer. And in this one performance, and he had been dead on stage for years, he's singing like, a black man on acid. Like he's just wailing. And it's one more, all I need is one more road to take me home. And then at the end of the show, the two encores, I believe the last one was Broke Down Palace, which is literally about leaving this world. So thanks a lot for watching, you guys. We will get into this topic again sometime soon. Thank you so much, all of you, and good night.